So today I want to talk about Iran. Iran's been in the news lately because U.S. Iranian relations have been very bad since Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. There's a lot of similarities going on right now between the U.S. and Iran and the U.S. and Iraq right before the Iraq War. If you are watching the news right now on any cable news network, you'll see tons of former generals, former admirals who are super pro military industrial complex, telling us how Iran is a threat to the US's national security, how Iran is a brutal dictatorship, how they're destabilizing the region, they're funding terrorism, how if the U.S. doesn't act now, they're gonna, have weapons of mass destruction. I mean, it's all pretty ridiculous considering the U.S. backs the actual largest funder of state terrorism, Saudi Arabia. Right now, they're committing a genocide in Yemen. Tens of thousands of people are starving to death. They don't have medicine. In basically a Saudi Arabian Iranian proxy war, and we're backing that war, so I would say we're already partially at war with Iran anyway, if you want to call it a war and not just a genocide at this point, when tens of thousands of people are dying. And the same thing is happening that happened before. We're claiming they have weapons of mass destruction, they're developing nuclear weapons, when, we're saying, oh, Iran pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. Oh, well, no, we pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. Donald Trump did, so they couldn't possibly be violating that deal when we're the ones who struck the deal in the first place. If we leave the deal, how can we still hold them to the standards of the Iran deal? That just doesn't make any sense. And it wasn't like it was a bad deal to begin with. First of all, Trump hasn't even tried, as far as I'm aware, to renegotiate any kind of deal. I haven't heard him put forward any kind of policy proposal. I mean, there's some genuine criticism of the deal that, it didn't prevent Iran from building up their military. It focused solely on nuclear weapons. Maybe that's genuine criticism, but let me say this. The Iranian people were outraged during the deal, when they signed the deal, because they thought it humiliated them. I mean, the far right of Iran was completely up in arms. I mean, it was dangerous for them to even get it passed, and really a diplomatic miracle, to be honest, that this far right Islamic extremist country actually agreed to preventing nuclear weapons from being made in exchange for the US lifting sanctions. I mean, all we were doing was ending our brutal, absolutely brutal sanctions that we had placed on them anyway since the Islamic Revolution. But we'll get back to that later. So, what I really wanted to talk about was the background of why this is happening, the history of Iran, because no one's really talking about it. They focus on what's going on right now. And if you look at that in a black box, in a bubble, you won't really know what's going on, because the US and Iran have a very long history, and I'm going to tell it to you right now, at least what I think is important. So we're going to start all the way back in World War II. I mean, I could go much further with Iranian history. I would love to talk about Cyrus the Great, but I'll save that for another day, maybe. So first of all, I think the first place I'd like to start is the Allies invading Iran in 1941, because I don't think many people talk about this, but the Allies and basically the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union invaded Iran in 1941 to make sure that Iranian oil fields, their oil reserves, didn't go to the Axis power. The Axis powers were struggling to maintain enough resources to continue their war efforts. They didn't have the oil reserves that the U.S. or the Soviet Union had, not even close. They really needed oil, they needed rubber, they needed other natural resources. So anyway, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and I guess Britain, launched this invasion of Iran to secure their oil fields. There's a debate whether that was justifiable, seeing as it was a total war against multiple fascist, brutal dictatorships who were genociding millions of people. So there's a debate to be had, and I won't debate it right now. But essentially, we left the Soviet Union to occupy Iran, and they didn't leave until after World War II ended in 1946, when they were guaranteed oil concessions from Iran. So, maybe it was justifiable, maybe it wasn't. I mean, it was basically just us invading a foreign nation unprovoked with no real legitimacy. I'm not going to, make an argument one way or another, but all I will say is that Iran certainly remembers, they know that the US let them be conquered by the Soviet Union, and I'm sure it's an embarrassment that they felt for decades. So they didn't forget, even though maybe we forgot. Anyway, skipping forward, after the post war period until 1953, Iran was a constitutional monarchy, basically a very similar government compared to Great Britain. They have a parliament and a prime minister. And in 1951, the prime minister of Iran democratically obtained the votes necessary to nationalize the British owned oil industry. So, this is where it really all fell apart. I mean, Britain responded by economically blockading Iran, but the nationalization went through anyway. The people of Iran, they were poor. They wanted the massive wealth that the oil industry was generating to stay in Iran and not to be exploited and sent overseas to, the British Empire. At this point in history, we all know the British Empire was a shadow of their former self. They had mostly retreated back to the island from whence they came. The U.S. really overtook them as the world's greatest superpower. After World War II, we had about half of the world's wealth. We had lent the Allies so much money. We were ridiculously wealthy. We were the world's reserve currency. We had afforded the Marshall Plan to build up some of the European countries and, let them come under the U.S.'s influence. So we were immensely wealthy. We had tons of power. And it was up to the U.S. to respond to this crisis, essentially, because Britain didn't really have the means to do it at this point. So the U.S. responded in 1953 when the CIA and Britain backed a military coup against the Prime Minister of Iran, Mossadegh. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Sorry to any Iranian people listening, but, doing the best I can here. So Prime Minister Mossadegh was put in house arrest and his foreign minister was executed. Iran was then ruled by an autocracy under a U.S.-backed Shah for the next 25 years. So essentially, because Iran had democratically elected a leader and parliament who decided to nationalize their own natural resources, to give some of those resources, the money earned from it, back to the people. We overthrew that government, instead installing a dictatorship in its place. This is really not talked about enough because Iran certainly remembers this. I'm sure it's bred much of the anti-Western hatred and a lot of the Islamic extremism. This isn't an isolated incident. The U.S. has backed tons of dictators against democratically elected regimes. I always like to use the example in 1973 when the U.S. backed a coup in Chile leading to the murder of President Salvador Allende. Rest in peace, Salvador Allende. We all miss you. Sorry, I just needed to say a short prayer for Salvador Allende. This was done because the U.S. feared a successful socialist country elected democratically. Mass incarcerations of over 100,000 people soon followed in Chile. This, too, is just one of many incidents I chose to talk about. I mean, the U.S. backed coups in almost every Latin American country, in Asia, in Africa. The U.S. is responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths in the dirty wars and the war on drugs against mild democratically elected socialists. who wanted to free the population from what was basically literal peasantry, who were just trying to buy up U.S. company land and then giving it back to the people. So we've just done this so many times. I mean, any country democratically elects a leader who wants to nationalize an industry and not let U.S. corporations exploit their wealth, give that wealth back to the people in the form of social programs, like healthcare and education. But the U.S. continually backs dictatorships in its place to make them safe for corporate investment by U.S. companies, is what I would say. It's always over the guise of free trade. So when you hear the term free trade, it's not free trade, it's free investment. It's free U.S. corporate investment in those countries. And we'll back dictators to make it happen many, many times. We're backing the Saudi Arabian government, probably the most brutal dictatorship in the world right now, genociding tons of people. We back dictatorships all over the world. So a similar coup is happening right now in Venezuela, where the U.S. under the Trump administration is sanctioning the country so severely that food and medicine can't reach its people. And we're just doing this to incite revolution to break out because of the desperation. I mean, it happens all the time. And this is exactly what we did in 1953 in Iran, and it worked. So the U.S. coup in Iran was successful in keeping Anglo-American corporations in control of Iranian oil reserves. Iran did not join the other Arab states in the 1973 oil crisis when OPEC embargoed the West from buying oil reserves during the Iran-Israel War of 1973. So this was all going great. That is until 1979 when there was an Islamic revolution in Iran, which transformed the country from absolute monarchy under the U.S.-backed Shah to an Islamic republic with a supreme leader. So we had basically fueled Islamic extremism, anti-Western sentiment. By backing this coup, we were choosing the leaders of a foreign nation, and the people of those nations, they're not happy about it. Just like we wouldn't be happy if Iran chose our next president. You know what I mean? I mean, it's no better than them choosing our president. Why should we choose their president? But getting back to this Islamic revolution, the Iranian people never forgot about the U.S.-backed coup, and this revolution led to the Iran hostage crisis. A sad state of affairs. It ruined the career of the most beloved peanut farmer the world has ever seen, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter holed out. I think he's 70, not 70, 96 right now or something. Jimmy Carter. He only did one term. You could run for president, Jimmy Carter. I'm just saying it's possible. I don't see why not, but moving on. A little known fact about the crisis is that it subsequently spawned Satan himself, although he prefers the name Ronald Reagan. He killed all those people in Latin America, but we'll talk about that another time. This revolution also led to the Iran-Iraq war fought by Saddam Hussein, who used chemical weapons against Iran. Saddam Hussein saw the destruction of Iran to be an opportune time to expand his country, as the Iranian military had been disbanded during the revolution. The war has been estimated to have a death toll of 1 million Iranians and 250 to 500,000 Iraqis. Yeah, you heard me though, 1 million Iranians. I'm sure they partially blame the U.S. for backing, really for that 1953 coup that really ends up leading to this 1979 Islamic revolution and subsequently the murder of 1 million Iranians. I'm not saying that's our fault, but it's certainly the chain of events that lead to these things. You know what I mean? You can't just ignore, how you get from point A to point B. It's not our fault that Iraq invaded Iran, but I could certainly see how some Iranian people may place blame on the US. And we really did drive this Islamic extremism. I mean, we've been backing Saudi Arabia for decades, who's the world's leader in promoting terrorism. I mean, they fund the most terrorists in the world, of a uniquely extremist version of Islam. Um, anyway, we'll talk more about that another time as well. I know I say that a lot, but hopefully I'll get to that. So now we're finally going to talk about the Iran nuclear deal in its proper context. We've seen how Iran's transitioned from a British style democracy to an absolute monarchy to an Islamic republic, all since World War II. So the Obama administration managed to negotiate a deal with Iran where, in exchange for Iran not supporting a nuclear weapons program, the U.S. would ease sanctions on them. We've been imposing sanctions on them since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. This is also why Iran has such high anti-Western sentiment. Excuse me, there. Uh, we've been starving the people, sanctioning them. It's just, as I mentioned before, it's the same thing we're doing in Venezuela now. We want another coup. We want another Shah that will let U.S. corporations exploit their oil reserves once again. It's no coincidence that Venezuela has one of the highest oil reserves in the world, and we're backing coups there, and so do Iran. So, pretty clear correlation in my opinion. Anyway, the U.S. Has been sanctioning Iran, and Obama managed to get rid of a lot of these sanctions, but Iran had to be willing to let nuclear inspectors check to make sure they weren't developing any nuclear weapons. And these inspectors did check. They routinely took place, and there has been no evidence that Iran violated the deal in any way. They're not allowed to have uranium enriched, past the point used in nuclear power, far less than the enrichment you would need to make a nuclear weapon. But the Trump administration, while they've been trying to undo basically everything Obama's done, they want to undermine the legacy of Obama, and this is probably one of his best accomplishments, preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. They want to look strong, and they have these right-wing fanatics like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo making much of the foreign policy decision to begin with. So the Trump administration completely scrapped this deal and reimposed sanctions on Iran. They clearly want another revolution in Iran to overthrow the Islamic Republic. Any kind of such revolution would probably lead to upwards of 1 million deaths. I mean, war with Iran, it will be like Iraq times 5. There's much more people in Iran. Their military is much more sophisticated. It will absolutely be a disaster. John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, they're some of the same people who instigated the Iraq war to begin with under false pretenses of nuclear weapons. And they want war with Iran. They know it will highly benefit the military-industrial complex. It'll benefit U.S. corporations. And at wartime, maybe most importantly of all, a wartime president is much more popular and much more likely to be reelected. And don't put it past Trump to instigate war with Iran solely for the purpose of winning his reelection campaign. I mean, look at Bush Jr. He never would have won his second term if it hadn't been for all the wars he started. His approval rating was like 30-something%, hugely unpopular throughout the country. He was really viewed as an idiot. Wartime presidents just do much better, and he managed to win the election nonetheless. And I'm sure Trump sees stuff like that, and he sees that might be his only path forward. I mean, new polling coming out that major presidential candidates would beat Trump in hugely important swing states like the Rust Belt, even Florida. Encroaching on Texas. Other states we never thought we could win, like Arizona. So Trump's probably shitting his pants at this point and looking for any way he could win in his re-election bid. And I would not put it past him to wage war against Iran for that reason alone. But let's talk more about Iranian nuclear weapons, because the US has nuclear weapons, and we also support Israel in the region, who also has nuclear weapons illegally. Under international law, only the US, France, Russia, Britain, and China can have nuclear weapons. No other country is allowed to, although several do, including Israel, Pakistan, and India, and, well, now pretty much confirmed North Korea. So Israel is not allowed to have nuclear weapons. Let's get that straight. And Israel is controlled by the far right Netanyahu administration. Um, they've recently annexed Syrian territory. They're absolutely gunning for the war path. It's pretty likely that they could be another instigator of a U.S.-Iranian war. We know if Israel was at war with Iran, the U.S. would have to back them. At least the U.S. would back them under the Trump administration. The Trump administration has been friendlier with Israel than I think I've ever seen of any president ever. I mean, Trump supported their move to the capital in them moving their capital to Jerusalem. I mean, the Israel having nuclear weapons is honestly one of the major things preventing peace in the Middle East. If Israel didn't have nuclear weapons, I think Iran and many other countries in the Middle East would feel a lot safer. They don't trust Israel. Why should they, honestly? I mean, Israel hates them as much as they hate them. Israel's blockading and sanctioning, and I don't know if, well, they're really terrorizing the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people are absolutely terrorizing Israel. I mean, the Palestinian people are launching missiles into Israel. Israel is responding by, shooting protesters, innocent civilians. They're encroaching on Palestinian territory with, Israeli settlements. They're annexing Syrian territory lately, all backed by the U.S., and it's just leading to more Islamic extremism in Palestinian people. In parts of Palestine, there's upwards of 40% unemployment. I mean, it's really a hot mess, and we're backing Israel with their nuclear weapons, and I guarantee they're pointed directly at Iran, their greatest adversary. Okay, so why shouldn't Iran have nuclear weapons? They saw that, if you look at Libya, Libya willingly gave up their nuclear weapons, yet then we backed a coup against Libya in 2011 that led to the brutal murder of Gaddafi. So at this point, it's like, why would Iran not build nuclear weapons? They're already being sanctioned. They're being threatened by Israeli nuclear weapons. They're being threatened by the U.S.'s nuclear weapons. They know that if they build nuclear weapons, it's likely that they wouldn't be invaded due to international fear over their nuclear weapons. It only makes sense at this point. So all this is just going to escalate the conflict. The U.S. has before, in the Iraq War, even though it was unjustifiable, they basically launched the war as a preemptive strike against Iraq obtaining nuclear weapons. And they'll likely do the same thing in Iran if there isn't massive, widespread protest against it. We need to show the Trump administration and any administration that follows that we do not support a war with Iran, a war that will be 5 times, if not 10 times greater than the war in Iraq. It will definitely lead to over 1 million casualties. I mean, there's no way around it. Iran is much larger than Iraq. They're much richer. It will be catastrophic, and we're closer to nuclear war than we've ever been, really, since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nuclear war with Iran, Pakistan, and India have heightened tensions, both nuclear powers. North Korea has nuclear weapons now, and the U.S. and North Korea been at odds now for many decades as well. So hopefully, the Trump administration can keep their shit together before we're at war with Iran, although that's probably what they want. I guarantee you Mike Pompeo and John Bolton would be perfectly fine with a war with Iran. They've wanted to eliminate the Islamic Republic for many years. Many people in the military industrial complex do. They know it will be hugely profitable for US backed corporations, the oil industry, the military industrial complex, and those people have huge lobbying powers over Congress. Congress has repeatedly refused to use their constitutional rights to declare war. We know for a fact that the Trump administration could unilaterally declare war on Iran without congressional approval simply by initiating offensive strikes. Since 9/11, Congress has never been able to actually assert its constitutional authority to declare war. The president does not have that authority. Yet, when both the House and the Senate passed a resolution to end the U.S. involvement in the genocide in Yemen, when we're backing Saudi Arabia, sponsored by Bernie Sanders, of course, the Trump administration, well, Trump himself, vetoed that, and now we're continuing to back that genocide. And hopefully, we aren't going to go to a hugely costly war in Iran. This would be a war like we haven't seen in many years. It would have to be a pretty decent mobilization by the US and would likely be a repeat of the Iraq War, where we would be there for well over a decade, probably see some kind of new terrorist organization take power, or old terrorist organizations like ISIS and Al Qaeda take root in the failed state that would take place in Iran. We backed a coup in Libya, and now they're just completely a failed state. There's open slave trades. We don't want to see that in Iran, which is much more populated. So hopefully we could prevent this conflict. We really need to spread the message that a war with Iran would be a horrible and costly decision, lead to millions, probably millions of casualties. So let's all hope it doesn't happen. For now, peace and have a good one.